Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi, I'm Oliver.
Hi, I'm Lily.
Science in Easy English with Oliver and Lily. Can you freeze a human and bring them back?
Such a wild question,
That
right?
really is. I mean, imagine getting a terminal medical diagnosis. Usually, that is a hard stop, the absolute end of the road.
Right.
But what if you could just hit a pause button instead? What if science allowed you to effectively wait out the clock until a cure for your disease is finally invented?
Which sounds like pure science fiction.
Exactly. But today, we are looking at what might be the ultimate medical cheat code.
Yeah, that concept is really the foundational promise of cryopreservation. And for this deep dive, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources to figure out if this is actually truly possible.
We've got a lot to cover.
We do. We are looking at peer-reviewed research papers on cryobiology, clinical reviews of advanced cell therapies, and even the actual day-to-day operational documents from major cryonics organizations operating right now.
Like real places.
Real places, yeah. Facilities like Alcor, the Cryonics Institute, and a Berlin-based startup called Tomorrow.bio.
And my mission here is to really strip away the sci-fi stuff. Because when most of us hear about cryonics, our brains immediately go to movies. Like someone trapped in a block of ice or suspended in this glowing blue tube.
Oh, absolutely. The Han Solo and Carbonite vibe.
Right. But the reality of trying to preserve a human biological system is vastly more complex. To understand if you can put a whole human on pause, we really have to look at what ultra-low temperatures do at the microscopic level.
Right, because cooling a biological system down is incredibly useful. It drastically slows down metabolism and biochemical degradation.
Just hits the brakes on everything.
Exactly. When you lower the temperature, the kinetic energy of molecules drops, meaning the chemical reactions that cause cellular decay simply cannot occur.
Okay, sounds good so far.
But dropping the temperature below the freezing point of water introduces a massive physical hurdle. The enemy in cryopreservation isn't the cold itself.
It's the water inside you,
Yes, the water is the enemy.
which is a huge problem considering the human body is like mostly just a walking bag of water.
Pretty much.
I've always heard this basic explanation that water expands when it freezes, right? And it creates these tiny, jagged ice crystals that act like microscopic daggers, literally piercing and rupturing delicate cell membranes.
That's the mechanical damage, yeah. And it is severe.
But diving into these cryobiology papers, the mechanical piercing is really only half the battle, isn't it?
It is. The chemical damage is what truly guarantees cell death. As water begins to freeze, the growing ice crystals actually only incorporate pure water molecules.
I mean, they leave stuff behind.
Exactly. They leave behind all the salts, the minerals, and cellular solutes in the remaining unfrozen liquid.
So the unfrozen liquid inside and around the cell becomes this incredibly harsh, hyper-concentrated salt bath.
Lethally concentrated. This triggers severe osmotic shock. Because the concentration of solutes outside the cell becomes so high, water is rapidly sucked out of the cell to balance the gradient.
Oh, wow. So the cell just shrivels up?
Violently dehydrates, yes. Its internal structures collapse, and the toxic levels of salt destroy the proteins. So traditional freezing is basically an absolute death sentence for complex tissue.
Which means the entire goal of modern cryopreservation is to avoid freezing entirely. Like, no ice whatsoever.
None. The target is a state called vitrification, which literally translates to turning into glass.
I was thinking about this, like putting a water balloon in a freezer. It freezes, expands, and pops. But vitrification is like replacing the water inside that balloon with a thick syrup, so it holds its shape perfectly without popping.
That is a great analogy. But to achieve that fluid dynamic shift in a human body, it requires completely swapping out the biological fluids with cryoprotective agents.
Cryoprotectants.
Right. Think of these as complex medical-grade antifreeze solutions. By perfusing the body with these chemicals, scientists can replace over 60% of the water inside the cells.
And then they cool it down.
Yep. When you lower the temperature of this new mixture down to around negative 130 degrees Celsius, it bypasses the crystallization phase entirely. It just doesn't freeze.
It turns into glass.
Exactly. The molecules slow down so much that they lock into a dense, highly viscous, amorphous gel. It is a glass-like state where biological time is suspended indefinitely with zero ice formation.
Okay, but, and this is a big but, pouring industrial-grade antifreeze into your veins has to be catastrophically toxic, right?
Oh, it is.
Because a chemical like DMSO, which is heavily cited in these papers as a primary cryoprotectant, that isn't something our cells naturally tolerate.
Not at all. The toxicity of cryoprotectants is actually one of the greatest limiting factors in the field today. At room temperature, high concentrations of chemicals like DMSO are incredibly toxic because they interfere with hydrogen bonding.
Meaning what exactly?
They essentially cause the proteins inside your cells to misfold and unravel.
Yikes. So how do they get around that?
To mitigate this, scientists have to walk a razor-thin tightrope. They introduce these chemicals at very low temperatures where the metabolic rate is already slowed down, trying to outpace the toxicity before the tissue is fully vitrified.
It still seems so counterintuitive, though. Bumping a body full of toxic chemicals to save it. There has to be, I don't know, a biological alternative to just flooding the system with synthetic antifreeze.
Well, the biological alternatives are where the research gets truly fascinating. Biologists are actually studying organisms that naturally survive extreme freezing environments.
And like what kind of organisms?
Like certain deep water fish and the darkling beetle.
Oh, man.
Yeah, these creatures naturally produce biological antifreeze proteins that bind to microscopic ice crystals the moment they begin to form, completely halting their growth.
That is wild. Can we use those in humans?
That's the cutting-edge research right now, looking at gene therapy. Scientists are experimenting with viral vectors to insert the specific genes that code for these antifreeze proteins directly into human cells.
Oh, I see. So instead of trying to pump the body full of external chemicals, you rewrite the cellular machinery so that tissue manufactures its own natural cryoprotectants.
That is the ultimate goal. And it has massive implications for mainstream medicine right now, not just life extension.
How so?
Well, if we can master this, the storage and transport of engineered immune cells for cancer treatments or even whole organs for routine transplants becomes infinitely easier.
That makes total sense. Okay, let's assume the biochemistry gets solved. We figure out how to cool the cells perfectly into that glass state without poisoning them.
Okay.
That brings up the logistical and, honestly, the legal timeline of when this procedure actually happens to a person.
Right. The timing is everything.
Because legally, a medical team cannot begin replacing your blood with cryoprotectants until a doctor has officially pronounced you dead.
Yes, that's correct.
But if you were already dead, the preservation feels pointless.
Yeah.
Game over, right?
It feels that way, but the disconnect there comes from how we define death. The medical and legal definition of death, which is clinical death, is simply the moment your heart and lungs stop functioning.
Right.
But biological death is not a singular moment. It's an ischemic cascade.
An ischemic cascade, meaning the chain reaction that happens when oxygen stops flowing to the cells.
Yes, exactly. When the heart stops, the cells don't just instantly vanish. They run out of oxygen, their energy stores deplete, calcium floods into the cells, and enzymes slowly begin to dismantle the cellular structures.
It takes time.
It takes time. For a short window after clinical death, your tissues, your organs, and crucially your brain are still structurally intact. They are just suffocating.
And that distinction is really the entire philosophical foundation of this industry. The sources refer to a concept called information theoretic death.
Yes, that's a huge concept in cryonics.
It essentially posits that a human being isn't truly gone until the physical structures of the brain are degraded beyond any possible repair.
Right, because the human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons connected by over 100 trillion synapses.
That is a staggering number.
It is, and that specific physical wiring, the connectome, is where your memories, your personality, and your identity actually reside.
So cryonicists argue that as long as the structural integrity of that physical map is preserved, the person is not dead. regardless of whether the system is currently powered on or off.
Exactly. And looking at it historically, our definition of absolute death has always shifted based on the technology we have available.
Right. Like if you go back to the 1950s, if you collapsed and your heart stopped beating, the doctors declared you irreversibly dead. That was it.
Yes. But today, we have CPR. We have defibrillators. We routinely resuscitate people who, by 1950 standards, were essentially corpses.
So treating a corpse as a patient isn't actually that crazy, historically speaking.
Not at all. The modern medical consensus views a stopped heart as a temporary, reversible condition. The cryonics industry operates on the exact same logic, just projected a century into the future.
They view a patient suffering from terminal cancer and ischemic damage the exact same way we view a stopped heart today.
Precisely. The procedure is not pitched as an immediate cure. It's described in the literature as an ambulance to the future.
I love that phrase, an ambulance to the future. The idea being that you stabilize the patient, halt the decay via vitrification, and bank on the development of molecular nanotechnology.
Yes, you are betting that future medical nanobots will be able to scrub those toxic cryoprotectants out of your cells, repair the ischemic damage caused by the heart stopping, and cure the original cancer that killed you.
It is a profound reliance on speculative exponential technological growth. But the reason it commands such serious scientific attention today is that the core mechanism, cryopreservation, is already a functional reality in modern medicine.
It absolutely is.
I noticed that in the clinical reviews. We aren't just talking about theory. Fertility clinics around the world are vitrifying and thawing human embryos, sperm, and oocytes every single day.
Every single day, people are giving birth to perfectly healthy children using embryos that were locked in that vitrified glass state for over 2 decades.
Over 20 years in glass.
Yeah. And the research has moved far beyond single cells and microscopic embryos. Scientists are studying poikilothermic animals right now.
Poikilothermic meaning gold-blooded, or what are they looking at?
Specifically, they are using newborn mice that haven't yet developed the ability to regulate their own internal body temperature.
Oh, I see.
Researchers can drop the core temperature of these mice to near 0 degrees Celsius. Their hearts completely stop. All respiration ceases.
They are clinically dead.
By clinical definition, they are dead. But when carefully rewarmed, they spontaneously resuscitate and resume normal biological function without any neurological deficits.
But a newborn mouse is tiny. The larger the biological mass, the harder this becomes, right?
Massively harder, yes.
Because the most staggering breakthrough I saw in these papers was the rabbit kidney experiment. They managed to preserve a complex, fist-sized organ.
The rabbit kidney experiment is a major milestone. Researchers successfully took a fully intact kidney, perfused its intricate vascular network with cryoprotectants, and cooled it down to negative 130 degrees Celsius.
Achieving complete vitrification.
Complete vitrification. It was stored in a stable glass state. Later, they rewarmed it, flushed out the cryoprotectants, and transplanted it back into a live rabbit.
And it worked.
The kidney regained full, life-sustaining function.
Which begs the obvious question. If we can do this with a whole rabbit kidney, what is the physical barrier stopping us from doing it to a whole human? I assume it comes down to the thermal physics of dealing with something as large as a human torso.
You hit the nail on the head. The mass of a human body completely alters the physics of heat transfer. And surprisingly, the insurmountable bottleneck right now isn't the cooling process.
Really? What is it?
It is the rewarming process. Waking the tissue back up is far more destructive than putting it to sleep.
I was trying to picture the physics of that. It's like, okay, if I take a completely frozen thick steak out of the freezer and put it in a microwave, the outside layers start cooking and boiling while the dead center is still rock-hard ice.
That is a very accurate, if slightly gruesome, analogy.
I just have to imagine that uneven temperature distribution in a vitrified human organ would be catastrophic.
Catastrophic is the precise word. Vitrified tissue is technically a glass. If you try to warm a large organ from the outside in, the outer layers expand as they heat up, while the cold interior remains rigid.
Oh, no. So it cracks.
It does more than crack. This thermal stress causes the entire organ to experience macroscopic fracturing. It literally shatters the tissue.
God, that's horrific. But wait, you also can't just let it sit at room temperature and warm up incredibly slowly.
No, you definitely cannot.
Because if you warm it too slowly, the protective glass state breaks down, and the water molecules suddenly have enough time and energy to organize into those deadly ice crystals we were trying to avoid in the first place.
Exactly. That process is called devitrification or ice recrystallization.
So you're trapped between shattering it or turning it to ice.
Pretty much. The speed of the warming process has to be blistering, hundreds of degrees per minute, to outpace the formation of ice. But it also must be perfectly uniform across the entire mass of the organ to prevent fracturing.
Which sounds impossible.
Achieving both simultaneously using traditional conductive heating is physically impossible for anything larger than a few millimeters.
Which brings us to a process the papers call nano-warming. This feels like the most science fiction element of the entire stack, but it is currently being used in labs. How do scientists heat a complex organ uniformly from the inside out at hundreds of degrees a minute?
They utilize mesoporous silica-coated iron oxide nanoparticles.
That is a mouthful.
It is. But basically, before the organ is cool, scientists mix billions of these microscopic magnetic iron particles into the cryoprotectant fluid and pump it through the organ's blood vessels.
Okay, so the organ is essentially saturated with magnetic iron dust.
Right. The tissue is then vitrified as normal. When it is time to wake the organ up, it is placed inside an alternating radiofrequency coil.
Like a giant electromagnet.
Kind of. The magnetic field alternates millions of times per second. This field interacts with the iron oxide nanoparticles, causing them to simultaneously generate heat through hysteresis.
Ah, I get it. Because the particles are distributed evenly throughout the entire vascular network, the organ heats up internally everywhere at the exact same millisecond.
Exactly. The outside doesn't warm any faster than the deep interior. You completely bypass the thermal stress and the fracturing.
That is brilliant.
It is. The laboratory results on sheep ovaries using this method have been groundbreaking. But of course, there's a catch.
There's always a catch. What's the immediate biological hurdle?
The aftermath. Iron oxide nanoparticles are incredibly toxic to living cells if left inside the tissue. Once the organ is rewarmed, the surgical team has to use specialized perfusits to meticulously wash every single nanoparticle out of the microcapillaries.
Before the organ can be transplanted or revived.
Exactly. And the fluid dynamics required to flush a human brain of nanoparticles without causing pressure damage to the fragile blood vessels is a monumental engineering challenge.
The fact that these incredible engineering challenges exist makes the current business of biostasis so fascinating to me. Because despite all these hurdles, there is a very real, very active industry selling this service to people today.
There is. And the logistics of the modern cryonics industry are staggering. Organizations like Tomorrow.bio in Europe or the Altor Life Extension Foundation in Arizona, they operate sophisticated, rapid response medical infrastructure.
And the cost reflects that infrastructure.
Yeah.
Looking at Tomorrow.bio's operational documents, signing up for whole body preservation runs around $200,000.
It is a massive investment.
Yeah, for the price of a high-end luxury sports car, you are buying a highly speculative ticket to the future.
So what exactly happens when someone who has paid that fee goes into cardiac arrest?
Well, the moment clinical death is pronounced by a doctor, the standby team takes over.
Right away. Immediately. They begin cardiopulmonary support to keep oxygenated blood moving to the brain, mitigating that ischemic cascade we discussed earlier.
God.
They pack the body in ice to induce rapid hypothermia. Then they surgically access the major blood vessels, wash out the blood, and perfuse the body with those high-concentration cryoprotectants.
And then the patient is transported to a long-term storage facility. The structural engineering of these facilities is wild, by the way.
It really is.
They don't use electricity to keep the patients cold, which makes them immune to power grid failures. The patients are lowered into massive, vacuum-insulated stainless steel dewars, which are essentially just giant thermos flasks filled with liquid nitrogen vapor.
maintaining a constant temperature of negative 196 degrees Celsius.
Negative 196 degrees.
Yeah, and at negative 196 degrees Celsius, biological time is completely arrested. The historical data on this provides incredible insight.
You're talking about the early pioneers.
Right. The very first person to be cryopreserved was a psychology professor named Dr. James Bedford, all the way back in 1967.
1967.
Wow. He was eventually transferred to Alcor's facilities, where he remains today.
I actually read about Bedford in the sources. The visual inspections of his preservation over the decades show he is still physically intact. But there's a stark contrast to Bedford, which is the infamous DIY case of Brado Morstall, the so-called frozen dead guy.
Oh, the Colorado case.
Yeah. His family literally tried to preserve him in a shed in Colorado using dry ice.
Which is a terrible idea. The physics of the Morstall case perfectly illustrate why high-tech facilities are necessary.
Because dry ice isn't cold enough.
Exactly. Dry ice sublimates at roughly negative 78 degrees Celsius. That is incredibly cold, but crucially, is significantly warmer than the glass transition temperature of water, which is around negative 130 degrees.
So at negative 78 degrees, the water in his cells isn't locked into that protective glass state at all.
No. At dry ice temperatures, there is still subtle molecular mobility. Chemical reactions haven't completely stopped. They are just moving at a glacial pace.
But over decades,
Over 30 years, that tiny amount of molecular mobility translates to severe cumulative degradation of the cellular structures. Long-term biological stability demands the ultra-low temperatures of liquid nitrogen to completely eliminate kinetic energy.
okay, so let's say you do everything perfectly. The standby team gets to you immediately, the vitrification is flawless, the liquid nitrogen is stable. How long are you floating in that thermos?
That is the million-dollar question.
I know some of these organizations recently ran the data through AI models, asking systems like Gemini and Grok to analyze the current progression curve of regenerative medicine and nanotechnology.
They did. The predictive models extrapolate based on the exponential growth of medical technology, and their consensus suggests that the requisite molecular machinery to repair cryoprotectant toxicity and reverse systemic damage might become a reality between the years 2070 and 2150.
That is a staggering timeline. 2070 is well within the lifetime of children being born right now.
It is.
But even if we hit that optimistic timeline, it requires a profound leap of faith.
Oh, it is entirely speculative. And to be fair, the contracts for these organizations are very clear about this. There are zero guarantees of revival.
Yeah.
It is an experimental procedure relying on future science that does not currently exist. But the driving philosophy behind the entire industry is actually quite simple.
What's that?
Being preserved in liquid nitrogen offers a non-zero chance of survival, whereas traditional burial or cremation offers exactly zero.
It essentially boils down to it beats the alternative.
Exactly.
The journey of this science is just incredible. We've looked at the fluid dynamics of avoiding internal ice crystals, the biological mechanisms of anti-freeze gene therapy, and the intense physics of utilizing magnetic iron nanoparticles to safely rewarm complex organs.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We've explored the shift from viewing death as a sudden stop to understanding it as an information theoretic degradation.
The intersection of biology and engineering here is pushing the boundaries of what we consider medically possible. But, focusing purely on the physical mechanics often obscures the psychological weight of this endeavor.
What do you mean?
Well, if we assume the information theoretic death model holds true and the preservation is flawless, we are left with a massive philosophical paradox.
Walk me through the paradox.
Okay, imagine the ambulance to the future works exactly as intended. The nanobots repair your cells, flush out the toxicity, and restart your heart.
Right.
You open your eyes in the year 2150.
Okay, I'm awake.
Your connectome is perfectly intact. That means every single memory you have is flawlessly preserved. You remember the exact sound of your spouse's laugh, you remember your children's faces, you remember the culture you grew up in,
Right.
but you walk out of the clinic and every single subject of those memories has been dead for a century. The society you knew is utterly unrecognizable.
Wow.
If you wake up with perfect recall in an entirely alien world, does surviving the medical procedure actually cost you your humanity?
That is a phenomenal, terrifying question to end on. Because preserving the brain is entirely focused on holding on to who you were, but waking up demands figuring out who you are supposed to be in a world you don't belong to. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into cryopreservation. Keep questioning the impossible and always stay curious.